I thought this would be a pretty powerful topic for everyone because one of the biggest challenges, especially since the pandemic started, but it's really been a challenge since the beginning of time, is getting people to adapt to and embrace change. And motivational inquiry is actually called motivational interviewing. But the reason I changed the wording from inquiry to interviewing is because usually when people hear the word interview, they have a negative connotation. And part of the challenge in being interviewed is when you are going through a job interview, which is the most common usage of the term, it often means being put on the spot, being intimidated, having to think on your feet, you know, being tested as far as your knowledge and confidence and so on and so forth. So it has a negative connotation. But the word interview, when we talk about motivational interviewing, the word interview actually has a power neutral term. And it implies a hierarchy, but doesn't necessarily have one. And here's a quick example. I do freelance sports writing for Associated Press, where I interview athletes from the Boston teams, where even though I'm the interviewer, they're in the power position as the athlete. So one of the things right out of the gate I want you to take from this training is to understand that in the case of an interview, I want you to associate the good characteristics of an interviewer. And if you take a step back and think about people that have interviewed you over the course of your career, or you as an interviewer, what are those characteristics and qualities you would take pride in? Well, one would be active and reflective listening, asking insightful and thoughtful questions, being prepared, being able to redirect and direct a conversation, using the power of pause and silence to give people time to think. And really, ultimately, the best interviewers are able to create psychological safety for open and honest communication so people feel comfortable speaking their truth. And so this training today is all about how to influence individuals through motivational interviewing, through the power of asking good questions and listening. So, Maria gave a brief introduction. I just want to add a thing as we get into this today. Mindset Go does training and coaching and consulting for companies all over the country. And people say, well, what makes you different from other companies? And it's our approach to communication. And our secret sauce, our ingredients to being a confident, effective, or influential communicator are emotional, conversational, and generational intelligence. And at the end of the day, when you are getting people to feel comfortable and safe in communicating, you need to be self-aware about the communication approach you use. You need to help people be motivated to act and comfortable to act. And you're going to see how the power of motivational interviewing is a huge contributor to habit change. So let's talk about habit change for a moment. Think about the last time you've changed a habit successfully. Did you have setbacks? Were you motivated to do so? Did you have a clear motivator to change that habit? Well, at the end of the day, when you think about New Year's resolutions and why people struggle to change habits, there are so many factors that go into habit change. And it includes questions like, do I want to change? What are the benefits of change? And where and how do I start? And so what's interesting is if you think of someone you know in your family, a close friend, even someone in the workplace who has a bad habit, and let's use an example of smoking. When someone smokes and we don't want them to smoke, what do we typically say to them? You really shouldn't smoke, it's bad for your health. But they know that. They already know the reasons that they shouldn't smoke, but yet they do it anyway. We know the benefits. Most of us know the benefits to eating better or exercising more or taking positive actions in our life, yet most of us still struggle to do it. And part of that revolves around the first concept I want you to take away today, and it's something called the writing reflex. And the writing reflex is spelled R-I-G-H-T-I-N-G. And the writing reflex is actually something not to do, and it's the kryptonite for critical thinking. So the writing reflex is when someone in a position of authority a leader, a parent, a coach tells you why you should do something or how to do something or why you should be better. And the problem with the writing reflex is we grow up constantly being told what to do by a parent, by a teacher, by a boss, and we end up shutting down because ultimately when someone tells us why we should do something or why we should do it, period, we get resistant to change and we get resistant to being open-minded to the request. So the first concept of motivational inquiry and interviewing is don't use the writing reflex. Instead of telling people why they should do something, help them draw their own conclusions, right? So how great would it be if something in the workplace was going on? Let's say someone was not turning in projects on time, or someone was coming in late for work. You can tell them they need to be on time for work because that's company policy, but they already knew that was company policy, yet they still came in late for work. So that's the writing reflex. So what you want to do is you want to get people to realize on their own how being late for work or how turning in projects late are adversely affecting their performance, their perception, an opportunity for growth or promotion down the line, a raise, opportunities in the workplace. You want them to recognize it as opposed to you telling them why they need to recognize it. The second thing is when you're a good motivational interviewer, you're increasing the level and quality of information gained in a conversation. One of the keys to being a good motivational interviewer is the conversation can't be rushed. One of the challenges I see that I help companies with all the time around leadership and human resources is having to talk to people about the same performance area over and over. So the question is, why do you have to have repeat conversations with people? Why don't they change habits the first time? Why don't they get the message? Well, ultimately it's because we use the writing reflex, and B, we give them consequences if they don't. And that's consequences are often not a motivator for people. So the purpose of a good motivational interviewing is to get to the root cause of the problem. So again, if someone's late for work, the root cause of them being late for work could be a number of factors, but it may be that they believe their performance is so strong in other areas that they believe they're entitled to come in late because ultimately they're not going to get fired. Ultimately, their performance won't affect their growth or opportunity. So in a case like that, you need to get to the root cause of the challenge. And part of what we're trying to do here is you're trying to strengthen a person's willingness and confidence to make changes. And I'm going to give you a very simple example that will really drive this point home. Most of us over the course of our lives have either been asked to rate something on a 1 to 10 scale, or you ask others to rate something on a 1 to 10 scale. And the universal scoring on a 1 to 10 scale is, if you ask someone on a 1 to 10, how willing they are to change a behavior or to quit smoking, if they say 1, 2, 3, or 4, they're probably not going to change. If you say 5, 6, or 7, they may change. And if they say 8, 9, or 10, you feel confident they'll change. So the difference is in motivational interviewing, one of the techniques you use is a 0 to 10 scale. Because if you ask someone on a 0 to 10 scale what their willingness to change is, this time, if they were to say a 1, 2, 3, or 4, they have some openness to the change. Otherwise, they could have said 0, but they chose not to. So there's got to be some hope to their willingness. Now, why I give you that example, why it's a critical example is I just spoke about why it's hard for people to improve their performance or change their habits in one conversation. If someone on a 0 to 10 scale is at a 1 to 4 about coming in on time, then it's unlikely in one conversation you're going to get them from a 1 to a 4 to an 8 to a 10. People don't make that drastic perspective and mindset changes in one conversation. So one of the goals of motivational interviewing is if someone has a very small likelihood to being willing to change, your goal is to get them to a 5 as opposed to a 7, 8, 9, or 10. And the key to a 5, what's really important about that is 5 in this case is ambivalence. And ambivalence means being detached from their emotions. We see people all the time being resistant to change. Look at masks. And I don't get involved with politics, but think about this for a second. People are so attached to being forced to wear a mask or being willing to wear a mask. There's an emotional attachment. They feel like their rights are being taken away. So if someone feels very strongly about not wearing a mask, okay, then the key there is how do you get them to detach from their emotions and embrace a different perspective? You have new policies and procedures in the workplace about remote leadership, about remote and hybrid work environments. This person has to come in all the time. This person can work from home. It's creating some conflict and uncomfortability in the workplace because people feel like certain people are getting privileges and others aren't. So what you have to think about here is you can't get people to change and adapt their behaviors until you get them to detach from their emotions. And that is a 5 on a 1 to 10 scale, and that is ambivalence. And what really is funny for a lot of people is when I tell them that your initial goal in motivational interviewing should be to get people to a point of ambivalence, it just doesn't seem right. Like it's like that's not what I want my standard to be, but it's the first step in behavior and habit change. So let's talk about the origin of motivational interviewing, because it is important as a background. This was actually created by doctors in the early 90s and even in the mid 80s, as far back as the mid 80s, because they were struggling to get their patients to change habits, whether it was drinking, whether it was smoking, whether it was obesity or any kind of habits like that. So they struggled to change. The doctors were trying to figure out a new conversation technique, a new communication strategy to get their patients to be more willing to embrace new habits. And it ended up really having a lot of impact. There have been many studies done that showed the impact. And so I decided when I started Mindset Go 6 years ago, I was going to take this technique and bring it to corporate America. And I was going to train HR people and leaders how to use this technique to get people to embrace a different perspective and change. So think about your secret sauce to motivate others. When I consult for companies, one of my favorite questions to ask when I interview someone is, could you share a motivational strategy you've used over the course of your career that has consistently facilitated behavior change? Now, I know that's a mouthful, but the point of the matter is your number one job as a leader is to motivate and inspire and coach and develop others. So how do you motivate people to act? How do you influence people's decisions and behaviors and habits? And that's why this strategy is so critical, because it is the ultimate strategy to get people to embrace that. Now, if you think about how we're raised as human beings, we are typically told that we have 2 techniques to motivate people: rewards and consequences. Do this, you'll get more money, you'll get a promotion, you'll get a prize, you'll get a day off. Don't do it, you'll get a consequence. And so what leaders struggle with often is when they don't have rewards or consequences to motivate people, they don't know how to motivate and get people to change their performance. So ultimately, what we're talking about here, when we tell people to draw out their individual conclusions, what we're saying is to get people to uncover their intrinsic motivators. Intrinsic, internally, why would they be motivated internally to do this? An example of an intrinsic motivator is, as a business owner and as a trainer, I love being successful. I love growing my company and seeing the revenue grow. That's my extrinsic motivator. But my intrinsic motivator is I love supporting people, helping people grow their confidence, shift their mindset, develop new core competencies. So that's an intrinsic motivator. So when I do this, ultimately, that's the reward I get. So when you're getting people to recognize why they should do something differently, you ask those questions to get people to draw the conclusions on their own to be able to articulate their intrinsic motivators. So let's go to the stages of change, okay? And, first, when you talk about what is your typical approach to get people to change, the feedback I typically hear from leaders is in that first conversation, they'll point out the problem. They'll hope they get alignment on the problem, because that's one of the reasons why performance in the first conversations don't go well. I call this conversational intelligence. So the reason why those first conversations often don't go well, because the leader and the employee or the team member aren't even aligned, A, on what the problem is, and B, on the urgency level of the problem. So a lot of times in a first conversation, leaders don't want to be seen as micromanagers or nitpicky. So it's kind of, hey, here's what I'm noticing. Here's what's happening. I want to bring it to your attention. I need you to, make sure you're not doing this again or repeatedly or whatever. And it's more of what I would call a warning conversation. And one of the other critical components that's often left out of that conversation is giving people the context of why you're speaking to the team member in the first place. And there we go again, the why. So, but the idea is to not use that writing reflex that I referred to earlier in this webinar. The writing reflex, you can tell them the why, or you can ask questions so they can recognize the why you're having that conversation. And let's be honest, the why impacts a lot of things. The why impacts how the behavior impacts the person being talked to, how it impacts your reputation, how it impacts the team's performance, how it impacts the core values of the organization. So when you're giving someone the why of behavior or habit change, it's not just the behavior itself, it's the people and the individuals getting impacted by the behavior. And again, that's often a piece missed in conversation. So when you look at why do we need to have repeat conversations, a very simple way to remember this as another takeaway today is, whenever you go into a conversation feeling like you need to do something or you have to do something, and the need and have to is what's communicated in the conversation, your goal in a motivational interviewing conversation is to get people to shift from needing and having to do something to wanting to do something, and understanding how it benefits them, the team, you, and the organization. Okay, so this is a big part of motivational interviewing, is understanding the stages of change. This is the human beings. This is how we think. This is how we feel. These are the roadblocks and barriers to getting people to embrace and facilitate change and adapt to change. Now, what's really important about this is, as you approach a conversation, when I spoke before about that 0 to 10 scale, the 0 to 10 scale is kind of the ladder of the stages of change. So before I go through these, the first thing you'd have to realize is, if you're sitting down to have a conversation with someone, you'd have to know what stage of change they're currently at. So as you listen to me describe these stages of change, I want you to take a step back and pause the webinar for a moment. And I want you to think of a challenge that you have with someone in your life. It could be personal, it could be professional, and think of what the challenge is, and then be theorizing what stage of change they're at and how you would approach the conversation with them based on them being at that stage of change. So let's walk through it. So as you can see on the slide, these are the 5 stages of change. We're gonna tackle pre-contemplation first. So pre-contemplation is really describing an individual who has no intention of changing their behavior. Now, there's 2 critical reasons why someone may have no intention of changing their behavior. One is they may be uninformed, meaning they don't know that they need to do something different. They haven't identified the motivation, they may have a blind spot, or they may know, but they don't believe they can do it. We call this unconscious incompetence. So if you don't know why a change would be beneficial, if you don't even know what you're doing wrong in the first place, you're not even mindful or self-aware of what you're doing wrong in the first place, then you're at that pre-contemplation stage. And the other reason, and this is big, and leaders miss this a lot, and HR people are better at this, but it's a real challenge, is people who are demoralized. So maybe people have felt they have made numerous attempts to change this behavior in the past, and it hasn't worked. What I find when people say that most often is when people say they've made numerous attempts, usually it's the same attempt multiple times. And I'll give you a very simple example so you know where I'm going with that. If you're a salesperson and you've reached out to a prospect and you've emailed them 4 times and you're not getting a response, well, you're trying the same method of communication 4 times. So if they don't respond the first or second time, they're probably not going to respond the third or fourth time. It doesn't work. So that person will say, Mark, listen, I've already tried 4 times to reach out to them, but you tried the same method 4 times. If you tell me you've already had 3 conversations with someone on your team about working from home and being productive, was there anything different in those 3 conversations as far as the technique or approach you used, or was it basically the same conversation 3 times? So at pre-contemplation, people either have a blind spot, they have unconscious incompetence, they don't know why it would be worthwhile to make the change, or their perception is that they've made numerous attempts that haven't worked, even though in most cases it will be the same attempt. Now, at the pre-contemplation stage, what you're doing, what your goal is remember, the pre-contemplation stage is basically a 1 to 4 on a 0 to 10 scale. So at that point, your goal is to get them to 5. Ambivalence, detaching from their emotions. So you'll know you achieved a pre-contemplation conversation effectively if they're walking away and at the start of the conversation, they were thinking to themselves, yeah, I'm not making this change. And they leave the conversation saying, you know what? Amy makes a good point. Maria makes a good point. I'm going to give that some thought. And they've become open-minded and willing to embrace a different perspective. That's pre-contemplation. So when you look at performance improvement conversations, if they're at the pre-contemplation stage, they're not open-minded to the change. They might tell you in that conversation, they get it. They may tell you in the conversation, they'll even agree to what you're asking because they're going to tell you what you want to hear. But ultimately, they may agree, but they're not committing, which is why you have repeat conversations. This is a big concept, the difference between agreement and commitment to the behavior. So that's pre-contemplation. So how do you do it? How do you get people, before we go to contemplation, how do you get people from pre-contemplation to contemplation? Well, the way you do it is you ask questions and you use active and reflective listening, and you don't use the writing reflex. When I think about communication skills, it's kind of interesting because one of the biggest trends in America right now is in colleges and universities across the country, communication degrees, the amount of students pursuing communication degrees is so much lower than it's ever been, because a lot of parents are looking at how much money colleges and universities are, and when their child may want to pursue a communications degree, it's like, well, what are they going to do with a communications degree? And the answer is everything. So why am I saying that? Why I'm saying that is because the ultimate communication skills are being able to actively and reflectively listen and to ask insightful, probing, impactful questions. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the term reflective listening is being able to essentially paraphrase back what you've heard. It is a critical communication skill because it's a win-win. When someone's sharing information with you, if you paraphrase back what you've heard, you validate what they're saying and they know they've been heard and they can say, yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. But if you misinterpreted the information, using reflective listening uncovers that misinterpretation and its ability to better understand what the other person's saying. So asking good questions and listening, that's how you get from pre-contemplation to contemplation. Now, let's talk about contemplation. So here's what's different. So contemplation is, remember, they're at a 5 on a 0 to 10 scale, and now they're considering making a change, but are reluctant to do so in the next 30 days. They recognize they have the problem. That's the big thing at contemplation. People are now aligned with you on the problem. They acknowledge it, but they don't necessarily have an urgency or a motivation around doing something about it. And, one of the things about, effective workplace leadership and communication is understanding you have choices. One of the things we hear over and over now is how busy everybody is. People like to wear it as a badge of honor to tell you how busy they are. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we make choices every day how we spend our time. So if you're trying to get someone on your team to change their behavior, and you're telling me you don't have time for a half-hour motivational interviewing conversation, there's a trade-off taking place. And it's the old expression, short-term pain equals long-term gain. You may have to invest more time up front with someone to facilitate behavior change or habit replacement, but you're getting it back on the other end because you're not having to have nearly as many repeated conversations with people. So at contemplation, you finally got alignment. They've admitted they have a problem, but they're still not really feeling urgent about it. So if the obstacles to overcome at the contemplation stage is the barriers and the benefits. So another phrase we often hear is work smarter, not harder. Well, so people think that way. People don't want more work, don't want more on their plate. I call this the reductive mindset. So part of your challenge in motivational interviewing is if you're asking effective questions, you're getting people to recognize what the barriers they perceive are and what the benefits they perceive are. So if someone feels like they don't have enough time to change their behavior, remember I mentioned earlier in the webinar about root cause, it's not really time, it's really commitment, because everybody has time, it's just what they perceive may fall by the wayside if they don't, or if they do this. So if they do this, they're going to look at it, well, if I do this, I may not have time for something else. So recognize when you're doing motivational inquiry that you have to get people to recognize what the barriers are, but then once you get them to recognize, that's when you've got to ask some deep, insightful questions to really get to the root cause of those barriers. It's not time management, it's prioritization, it's commitment, it's non-negotiable core values. So that's as far as the barriers. As far as the benefits, this is where the intrinsic motivator piece comes in. Why should they do it? And a lot of leaders get very triggered and angry because they say to me, Mark, what do you mean, why should they do it? They should do it because that's what I'm telling them to do. They should do it because that's company policy. Yes, I understand. That's true. But at the end of the day, that may be the case. But part of being a good motivational interviewer is removing that hierarchy of boss to employee, of HR person to employee. That's that writing reflex. The reason why we don't want to use the writing reflex and tell people what to do is it reminds the employee that of the hierarchy. So yes, that's true. They do need to follow company policy. They do need to do what you ask, but rather than jam that down their throat and use the writing reflex, ask questions to uncover why they would benefit, how they see the benefits to changing their behavior. That's what it's about at that contemplation stage. And, one of the things that's really, really important is something I call effortless empathy. And, one of the biggest problems in the pandemic that I'm seeing are leaders are torn because they feel bad. People are adapting to work at home in different environments and different policies and procedures and family and health challenges. So people are feeling empathetic. Leaders and bosses are feeling empathetic to that. And that's great. They should. And at the same time, they need to hold these people accountable to do their job and be productive and not let their quality and performance suffer. So leaders are torn. Some leaders are overly empathetic and not holding people accountable, and some people are totally focused on accountability and not being empathetic. And this is something I call simultaneous emotions, where you can do both. You can hold people accountable and be empathetic at the same time. And I'll give you an example. Someone's performance is suffering, and you start talking about it, and the person says, I'm really having trouble adjusting to the hybrid work environment. And then you can be empathetic to that, and you could ask questions to better understand why and how they're suffering and struggling with that. And then after you have that part of the conversation, then you can say, with that said, Maria, I still need you to do this project, to do this task, to perform up to the standards we've set. So it's not a trade-off. You can do both. And so effortless empathy is defaulting to empathy. In sales, for those of you who are familiar with sales, one of my biggest pet peeves in sales training is when people refer to rapport building as a stage. Rapport building is not a stage of the sales process. Rapport building should happen all throughout the sales process, and it should never stop. Well, that's the idea with effortless empathy. If your default reaction is to understand and be empathetic, as a motivational interviewer, using inquiry techniques, you're asking questions to better understand how people are struggling and why they're struggling. One of the things that is missed when people don't change habits and behaviors after the first conversation is why they didn't. And I alluded to the root cause earlier. There's so many reasons why people struggle to change. It could be their confidence level. It could be they don't have the knowledge to know how to implement the change. It could be they don't have the skills. It could be they don't believe they have the resources or support system. I could go on and on. But those are the reasons. So it is critical why you want to be effortlessly empathetic and default to empathetic reactions is because when you ask questions and take time to get to understand why people aren't doing the actions that you want them to do, you'll get to that root cause and you'll understand why they're not able to achieve what you're asking. Now, there's one other thing I want to just talk about before we move on to the preparation stage, and that is conversational intelligence. And so I'm going to show you. All right. So let's talk about a communication technique I teach called heavy lifting. So I keep reinforcing the point during this webinar about the importance of asking questions. So yes, it's critical. So the importance of asking questions, if you ask someone, imagine this, picture yourself in a conversation right now where you're following the techniques I'm teaching you and you're asking someone, what do you see as the benefits to making this change? It's such an unusual question to ask someone that I can guarantee you at the first pass, they're probably going to say, I don't know, I haven't really given it a lot of thought. And so a lot of the reasons why people struggle in these difficult conversations is because once people don't cooperate, once people don't give an answer to the question you're asking, we become impatient. And that's when the writing reflex kicks in. So you ask someone, hey, why would it be worth making this change? And the person's like, geez, I don't know. Well, then the leader says, well, if you make the change, maybe people would be more willing to promote you or give you additional opportunities. No. So this heavy lifting technique I'm teaching you, what I'm recommending you do is when someone doesn't cooperate, and in all fairness to the person who's not cooperating, they're being put on the spot. They haven't had time to prepare and give thought to this question. So if they say, geez, I really haven't thought about it, your response should be, totally understand. You may not have been prepared for the question. We're not in a rush. Take a couple of minutes. Think about how this would help you, the team, the company, if you were willing to make this change. And give them a couple minutes. Now, if after a minute or two, they're still being stubborn and really don't have anything to contribute, I would actually stop the conversation at that point. And I would say, well, you know what, before we go any further, I think it's important that you identify the benefits and why you would be motivated to make this change. So why don't you give it some thought? I understand I put you on the spot, and let's reconvene in a couple of days after you've given it a little more thought. And I would continue the conversation at that point. So the two techniques I've just walked through, one is, I call it 3 strikes. So give people 3 chances to come up with something. So when you reconvene in a couple of days to have that conversation, then if at that moment they still don't have anything, then you're going to have to stimulate some thought. And so the second technique, the heavy lifting technique I alluded to earlier, is if someone's struggling to identify a benefit or a motivation for changing the behavior, you can say, well, what about an opportunity to take on more responsibility? Would that be something that would motivate you or be a benefit to you? So give them an idea, stimulate some thought, but then after you give them an idea, be quiet and pause and let them process the idea. And hopefully they'll say, yeah, I guess that's true. And then you can come in with, so what else like that do you think would benefit you? So there's patience in motivational interviewing. And I would say the most effective motivational interviewers, 75 to 80% of the communication in that conversation is you asking questions, not making statements. Making statements are the writing reflex. Asking questions are trying to learn and understand other people's barriers, motives, benefits, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the contemplation stage, and that's what you're really focusing on at the contemplation stage. Now let's get to the preparation stage. So at the preparation stage, people are ready to test the waters. They're willing to make incremental progress. And before we get into preparation, I want to make a critical point about progress. You know, it is so hard to change behaviors and replace habits that you want to make it palatable. I was talking to someone the other day in my drive to lose weight, and I said, God, I got to stop eating so many carbohydrates. And the person said, well, that feels daunting. Like, how much food do you eat with carbohydrates in it? And I said, a lot. So they said, well, what's probably a food you eat a lot of the time that has carbohydrates? And I said, blueberry muffins. And they said, don't you think it would be easier to tell yourself to start with stopping to eat blueberry muffins and then focus on another food that has a lot of carbohydrates, than making a blanket statement of, I need to stop eating so many carbohydrates? So I give you that example because what's critical at the preparation stage is the person that's going to execute and implement the changes that you're asking. They have to feel like it's doable. They have to feel like it's not daunting, like it's going to be working harder, not smarter. So you know that. That's human behavior. If people look at yourself, think about how hard it's been for you over the course of your life to change habits or behaviors. Think of things on your to-do list that get procrastinated. They get procrastinated because often they feel daunting and they feel like they're going to take a lot of work. Why do people start their day by responding to emails? Because it's quick and it gives people a boost, like they're being productive, as opposed to tackling their biggest priorities and goals. So at the preparation stage, your mindset has to make the change incremental progress, has to make the first few steps in the process feel like you can do them. So there's 3 things you're doing at that stage, right? You're developing a plan with SMART goals. And for those of you who aren't familiar with SMART goals, specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely. And it's critical. You have to believe the attainable, the A is what I was just talking about. You have to believe you can attain the goal, because if you don't believe you can attain it, who wants to pursue a goal they don't believe is attainable? So develop a plan with SMART goals. Pick 1 to 3 incremental steps to get started. Don't tell them the steps. That's the writing reflex. Have them articulate the steps. And the third piece is shift from a daunting mindset to a doing mindset, right? We can't fix everything, so let's start with some minor changes. So you're asking them, what do they think are some small steps, all right? So think about trauma, burnout, like burnout from the pandemic. I mean, how many people are feeling burnout? So if you're feeling burned out, there's no secret sauce solution that someone can put in place in one day to stop feeling burned out. It's taking some small steps to reverse the burnout trend. It's a perfect example. So the goal at the preparation stage is to get people to shift from it's important I make this change to the action I'm confident I can make this change. When you have that preparation conversation or that preparation part of a conversation, you have got to be confirmed that they are confident and committed to making this change. Well, confident to make the change and committed to doing those 1 to 3 incremental steps. If you don't get that at the end of the conversation, then it could go wrong and you may backfire and be stuck at that preparation stage a lot longer than you desire. And you can tell, like when people are confident, if you ask people, you can say, are you confident? Which is a closed-ended question, or you can ask people, why are you confident? Which kills 2 birds with 1 stone. So ultimately what you're trying to ask is, what makes you confident you can make this change? If they can articulate that, then they're confident. So that's the key before you get to the action stage. Okay, action stage. So let's talk about that for a moment. So, what's interesting about the action stage is, you're making changes to your individualized plan that are observable, measurable, and will result in some type of benefit. So when I say making changes, you set those 3 goals at the preparation stage, and now you may need to modify the plan. Maybe priorities have shifted. Maybe one of the steps that you thought was the most urgent step in the action plan isn't, and there's 2 steps that need to come before that. So it's follow-up from the leader. How soon do you follow up? A day later, a week later, a month later? Well, it's situational. It depends on the behavior or habit you're trying to improve. But what I always encourage people to do is I really encourage people to not wait any longer than a week or 2, because if people have a setback, you need to know why they're having the setback. Now, you'll notice the reinforcement's really key here. When people make progress, I don't care how little the progress is, it is important to reinforce that progress. It's also important to create an accountability structure. And what I mean by an accountability structure is, who's holding the person accountable? Is it you? Is it a peer on the team? That's critical, because people need to be accountable. If they've made the commitment and they're confident they can do it, what is the accountability plan? In other words, if they do have a setback, do they feel comfortable coming to you, admitting they're struggling, and looking for guidance and mentorship, how to get back on track? Which leads me to the setback piece. Okay? Now, think of how awkward it is to build in a plan B after someone has said they got it. No, I'm confident, I'm committed, I can do this. But you have to actually plan out a plan B after they've already said they're confident. Yes, you do. Because one of the challenges I see is a lot of times when people try to change a habit or behavior and they have a setback or they perceive failure, then they don't say anything because they're embarrassed and they don't want to be judged, and they go back to their old ways, which increases frustration all around. So there's one of the courageous conversations I teach leaders to have is what I call a plan B, or a relapse discussion or setback discussion. And the key for today that I want you to take away is, after the person says they're confident and committed, you can say, awesome, I'm excited, I'm thrilled to support you in any way I can. And one last question. If you do have a setback, what will be your approach? What will be your plan? How will you handle a setback? And they're probably going to be surprised. Again, like I said earlier, they probably haven't thought that question through. But you want to collaborate with them on that, because you want to find out if they would feel comfortable coming to you, if they would feel comfortable admitting it. And part of the challenge, and this is a whole other training, but it's, what are your standards for success? As a leader, if your only standard for success would be that they achieve all 3 of the items on the action plan in the time allotted, and they only do 2 of the 3, and you see that as a failure, then they'll see it as a failure and they're unlikely to come to you for support. But if you model the behavior that incremental change is good, if someone committed to 3 steps to me as their boss, and they came to me and I said, how did it go? In our follow-up conversation, and they said, well, I did 2 of the 3. My response would be fabulous. You must feel really good about getting those 2 done. And that would be the first part of the conversation. The second part of the conversation would be, so what happened with the third one? What got in the way? And let's talk through that. But your approach to that as a leader is critical, because if your standard is high or not aligned with their standards, then that plan B can go awry very quickly. So let's go to stage 5, which is maintenance. Okay. So maintenance is maintaining the behavioral changes that have yielded significant benefits for 6 months. Now, I know there have been tons of studies of how long you have to do a new habit for habit change to take place once and for all. Some people say 30 days, 90 days. There's all kinds of studies out there on the amount of days. The biggest thing is follow-up and accountability. One of the things that I often chuckle about when people are onboarded at a company is they're often trained on different things when they're onboarded. Sometimes they have to pass a test to understand they have the knowledge. Ironically, sometimes they just have to pass the test, and which means they may have 70% of the knowledge that they're supposed to know, but yet they get to move forward, but that's for another day. So my point is that when people get trained on skills and information at a company, once they're trained, we usually don't follow up to see if they're struggling with any of the things from the training. And then we find out later on they didn't fully understand something, or they're getting complacent and they're forgetting a process and they're doing something their own way. So one of the key aspects of motivational inquiry is the ability to have consistent follow-ups. You can follow up at intervals, 2 weeks, a month, 3 months, 6 months, but you need maintenance. Milestones and checkpoints are critical to behavior and habit change. So part of that is, as the leader, is being accountable. You have to be accountable to making sure you're doing the follow-up. There's accountability on both sides. They have to be, the team member or the employee has to be accountable to their commitments, to the incremental steps in progress, and then you have to be accountable to be supportive and follow up and care. So it takes 2 to tango, and is very much in that case. Now, as our final piece today, I really want to cover the key takeaways to being an effective motivational interviewer and using motivational inquiry to get to the root cause. And if you are interested in getting additional training on this, like I said, it's so powerful, but it's certainly something you can't fully teach and execute in an hour. When I do these training programs, either half-year or year-long training programs, companies are finding the impact of productivity and employee engagement are sky high relative to where it started, but it is an investment of time, and it is not an easy technique to master, full disclosure. So it takes practice, it takes a commitment, but if you talk to people that I work with, they'll tell you the impact it has had. So let's just do a quick review of the key things. As I talked about, the writing reflex, invite critical thinking. Part of the thing we want to develop in the workplace is we want people to feel like they have a process and comfortable making decisions, that they're innovative and critical thinkers. So the writing reflex destroys critical thinking. You telling people what they should do and why they should do it does not develop critical thinking. Number 2, so centrally fundamental to motivational interviewing, asking questions as opposed to making statements. Again, in if you as a leader, if you as a human being, every time, because I do a lot of work with emotional intelligence, every time you get frustrated, annoyed, have a default reaction and assume the worst, if you could default to asking a question to better understand what you're hearing or observing, as opposed to stating a frustration, there'd be so much less conflict in the world. So that's key. Default to asking questions as opposed to making statements, especially when you get triggered and frustrated. Determine the root cause. The peripheral problem is very rarely the real problem. Often I get calls from companies saying, Mark, we need you to come in and help us with this. After I interview people at the company and give assessments around emotional intelligence and communication, it's almost never the problem companies thought it was. They haven't yet gotten to the root cause of why people are acting and thinking the way they are. Reflective and active listening, we spoke about. Effortless empathy, again, don't be a person that uses checkbox empathy. Checkbox empathy is doing it because society tells you you should be empathetic and you feel like you're supposed to in a certain situation. Effortless empathy is defaulting to being empathetic, being an empathetic listener, understanding and asking questions. Seeking ambivalence, getting people to detach from their emotions. Like I said, on a 1 to 10 scale or 0 to 10 scale, you're shooting to get people who are at that 1, 2, 3, or 4 level to detach from their emotions of their resistance. Why do people not want to wear a mask? Why won't people, are people unwilling to work from home or at work or in a hybrid situation? If they're attached, if they're angry and they're frustrated, get them to a point where they're detached from their emotions. And lastly, my favorite phrase in Mindset Go is be curious. Be curious. If your default reaction, and I'm going to give you one simple anecdote to end this today, and that is this. When you'll hear a lot of people talk about the importance of defaulting to positive and positive psychology, which of course is really important. But when someone does something to upset you, a lot of people will give you the advice to be glass half full. Don't assume the worst. It wasn't about you. So right now, most people realize that they have two choices or believe they have two choices when they're frustrated with someone else. You can either default to the worst, think the worst of someone and think about that they had malicious intention, or you could do the opposite and say, you know what, nah, they must be having a bad day. It's not about me. You can do that. Or you can do the third one, which is what I want you to do, is be curious. Don't assume anything. Be curious to better understand why people did something, whether they wrote a negative email, whether they communicated with her a certain way, whether you felt they disrespected you. Being curious supports asking questions. It supports reflective and active listening. It supports effortless empathy. It supports all of these things. So put a sticky note on your desk with that 2-word phrase, be curious. And if you can start communicating with the default reaction to being curious to support that effortless empathy, that would be huge. And last but not least, to end this today, I would just say, from a mindfulness perspective, many of you may not be familiar with mindfulness, but to keep it simple to end today, mindfulness, be present. Our minds feel full all the time. We're racing from meeting to meeting, from task to task, and email to email, and that doesn't even get into our personal life. So I would encourage you, when you're having conversations with people, the most difficult conversations with people around performance improvement and behavior change, be present, be mindful, be focused on listening and supporting that person. Because if your mind's elsewhere, it will show and will impact your ability to have a successful conversation. And that's going to do it. And thank you for your attention. And if you want more information about Mindset Go, you can certainly reach out at info@mindsetgo.com, 978-793-1159. And Maria and Bill, thank you so much for the opportunity to present today, and love what you're doing at the Hanscom Federal Credit Union.